General Hospital spoilers reveal that the moment Willow's needle pierced Drew's skin, something deep inside him shifted in a way no one in that hospital room could recognize. The injection was meant to stabilize him, to pull him back from the edge of physical collapse, but instead it stirred a dormant corner of his mind that had been sealed shut. Since the night he was shot, it was subtle at first, a tremor beneath the surface, a faint pulse of memory struggling against the static of trauma. But as the medication flooded through his veins, the tremor grew teeth, clawing upward until a wave of sensation crashed over him. He felt cold tiles, the weight of his body against the floor, and beneath that, a thin ribbon of sound threading through the darkness. It was not the sound of gunfire, nor the frantic echo of footsteps. It was softer, urgent, uncertain of voice. Then another, one high with panic, one low and unsteady. To voices hovering over him in the moments he had believed he was entirely alone. He did not remember words, but he remembered tones. The fragile tremor of Trina Robinson's fear, the tightness in Kai Taylor's throat, and the distinct sense that he had been seen, discussed, maybe even judged while he drifted in the space between consciousness and oblivion. That single sliver of recognition acted like a wedge forcing open the locked door of his memory. The moment it cracked, everything inside began to spill forward with uncontrollable force, and Drew, still weak and reeling in the aftermath of the injection, felt the shape of a new reality forming around him, one shaped not by truth, but by instinct, suspicion, and a hunger for answers. As his consciousness sharpened, he felt something else awaken with it, a darker impulse he had spent years trying to bury. He had always prided himself on logic, restraint, and discipline. But trauma had changed the architecture of his mind, laying new foundations built from betrayal and fear. The injection had not merely restored memory, it had recalibrated his emotional compass, pushing him into a psychological territory where his need for justice blurred dangerously with a craving for retribution. A new adjustment was unfolding inside him, one that twisted every recollection, every detail, every breath from that night into a threat that demanded neutralizing. Now, when he closed his eyes, he could clearly picture Kai and Trina standing above him, their breath uneven, their silhouettes cast in jagged light. He could feel their hesitation, their uncertainty, and instead of interpreting it as shock or concern, the new fracture in his psyche interpreted it as guilt. Why had they been so close? Why had their voices trembled? Why had neither of them rushed forward to help him? The questions multiplied faster than he could control, creating a labyrinth of possibilities in which Kai and Trina were not witnesses, but participants, silent collaborators in a larger betrayal. Every detail he examined began to warp, aligning itself with this new narrative forming in the shadows of his mind. Drew's pulse grew heavier each time he replayed those voices. The sensation was no longer just memory, it was accusation. The injection had unlocked not only fragments of the past, but also a darker willingness within him to assume the worst, to follow instinct rather than evidence, to let anger breathe in places where logic should have lived. This new adjustment inside him fed on unresolved questions like a creature awakening. After a long sleep, it whispered that neutrality was weakness, that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. And with each passing hour, Drew felt himself drifting toward a version of his own identity he had always feared. A man guided not by justice but by vengeance. He began observing Kai differently. Every movement, every whispered conversation, every cautious glance now felt incriminating. He noticed the hesitation in Kai's voice, the guardedness in his posture, and instead of attributing it to pressure and fear, Drew saw it as the slippery guilt of someone hiding a secret. Meanwhile, Trina's gentleness, her instinctive empathy, now seemed like a mask. Her silence about that night now appeared deliberate, and Drew convinced himself that her compassion was a facade concealing something far more dangerous. He felt betrayed not by their actions, but by their lack of transparency, and that perceived betrayal dug deeper than any physical wound. Drew's internal shift began to manifest outwardly in small ways. A new hardness settled in his eyes, a cold calculation replacing his usual candor. He found himself separating from the people who cared about him, retreating into a mental bunker where only suspicion and strategy could enter. His trauma-trained instincts, once used to protect innocent lives, now fueled the idea that he needed to expose the truth through whatever means necessary. The darkness forming at the edges of his consciousness began to fill the spaces where patience and reason once existed. He became sharper, faster, more inclined to believe that confronting the threat meant anticipating the enemy, even if the enemy existed only in the corridors of his fractured memory. This adjustment inside him grew with every breath. It fed on imagined betrayals, on half-formed recollections, on the emotional vulnerability he despised but could not escape. Drew started to think of the night he was shot not as a tragedy, but as a test. Someone wanted him to fail. Someone who expected him to stay broken, amnesiac, powerless. The idea that Kai and Trina might have played a role, any role, became the spark that ignited a deeper rage simmering in his gut. He began to picture scenarios where they had spoken to the shooter, where they had seen his fall and walked away, where they had whispered over his body because they believed he could no longer hear or live to remember. Reality mattered less than the stories his wounded subconscious constructed. Drew's steps toward darkness were small at first, but they grew bolder as his reconstructed memories gained emotional weight. He began to imagine confronting Kai, cornering him, forcing the truth out of him with the same merciless intensity that had once made Drew a feared operative. He began to envision a reckoning, one in which the innocent and guilty alike would be dragged into the light simply because his instincts demanded it. And beneath that hunger for answers pulsed another truth. Drew no longer trusted himself to tell the difference between justice and obsession. The adjustment had fused those two ideas until they were indistinguishable. As days passed, Drew found himself rehearsing conversations in his mind, conversations that never occurred, moments he had invented, scenarios in which Kai and Trina confessed to betrayals they had never made. These imagined confessions soothed him even as they fueled his anger, creating a cycle of self-deception that made the darkness inside him feel not only justified, but necessary. He began to believe he was the only one capable of uncovering the truth, the only one who understood the scope of the dangers surrounding him. And once he believed that, the path before him narrowed into a single road leading toward confrontation. The most chilling part of this transformation was how calm Drew felt about it. The fear that once paralyzed him had become fuel. The uncertainty that once weakened him had become sharpened instinct. And the helplessness of lying on the floor, bleeding and alone, had been replaced by a fierce determination to strike before anyone could strike him again. He saw himself as a survivor reclaiming power, not realizing that he was crossing the threshold into a place where power demanded sacrifice. The sacrifice of truth, of trust, and perhaps of innocent lives. This new adjustment in Drew's psyche was no longer merely a response to trauma, but a framework reshaping his entire interpretation of the world. It whispered that betrayal was everywhere, that allies were temporary, that fear was a signal to attack. And as Drew embraced this darkness more fully, he began to see not only the possibility, but the necessity of taking action against Kai and Trina. If memory had awakened to warn him, then he believed he had an obligation to respond. If their voices had lingered in the dark, then he believed they were part of the danger. By the time his memories stabilized into something resembling clarity, the transformation was nearly complete. Drew no longer cared whether the voices he remembered were real or imagined, whether Kai and Trina were innocent or guilty, whether the darkness guiding him was born from truth or trauma. All that mattered was the mission forming in his mind, a mission that required no oversight, no approval, no hesitation. He would find the answers, even if he had to tear apart the lives of those he once cared about. And in that silent vow, Drew crossed a line he could never return from, stepping into the identity he had fought against for years. A man willing to pursue justice through darkness, even if the darkness came from within himself. The moment Drew finally connected the last fragments of memory, when the blurred sounds, fractured images, and disjointed instincts aligned into something unmistakable, his world shifted into a shape he no longer recognized. It was not simply the revelation that Kai had been involved. It was the horrifying clarity that Kai had not acted alone. Michael Corinthos, the man Drew once treated as family, had been the one orchestrating the entire ambush, while Kai served as his silent accomplice, standing in the shadows, ensuring the plan unfolded exactly as intended. This truth did not return to Drew gently. It slammed into him with the force of the bullets that tore into his back, rupturing what remained of his faith and shattering the final pieces of who he used to be. The adjustment happening within him was no longer subtle. It was a violent remodeling of his identity, a restructuring born from betrayal. So deep it rewired the way he perceived every breath and every movement around him. This adjustment was not merely mental. It seeped into his nerves, stiffened his muscles, and poisoned the rhythm of his heart. He felt the change as a cold burn behind his eyes, a tightening in his chest, a tremor in his hands that refused to be calmed. His mind, once sharp and disciplined, now operated like a machine with new programming, directing all energy toward a single objective: retaliation. The revelation did not just make him angry, it awakened a primal instinct that had been dormant for years, an instinct shaped by war, trauma, captivity, and survival. It whispered that forgiveness was extinction, that hesitation was death, and that the only path forward was to strike back before his enemies sensed he was no longer blind. But something else was happening beneath that rising fury. The same adjustment that sharpened his instincts also hollowed out the structures that made him functional. The new psychological blueprint forming inside him was unstable, built on fractured memory, relentless paranoia, and a rage so consuming it began to corrode the very parts of his mind responsible for control. The more he accepted the truth about Kai and Michael, the more his body betrayed him. His hands stopped obeying him. His breathing turned unpredictable. His vision dimmed around the edges, as though the world itself was retreating from him. It felt as if some invisible force was dismantling him piece by piece, stripping away the skills that once defined him. The adjustment was not empowering him, it was devouring him. Yet Drew pushed through it, convinced that pain was simply the cost of clarity. He spent hours replaying the reconstructed memory, Kai's breathless whisper, the hesitation in his movements, the way he lingered over Drew's fallen body, not out of concern, but calculation. He saw Michael's shadow merging with Kai's, forming a partnership forged from ambition and fear. The betrayal tasted metallic on Drew's tongue, thick and suffocating, fueling the violence simmering beneath his skin. He imagined what he would do once he confronted them. He pictured Kai collapsing under the weight of Drew's rage, and Michael breaking under the truth he had tried to bury. The fantasies grew darker, more specific, shaped by the instincts of a man who had survived manipulation, captivity, and warfare. The adjustment inside him insisted that justice was no longer enough. There had to be consequence, there had to be ruin, and there had to be fear. But as the desire for revenge intensified, so did the collapse within him. His mind became a battlefield, one where instinct and deterioration waged war against each other. His memories sharpened even as his motor skills faltered. His focus deepened even as his thoughts twisted into loops he could not escape. Every step toward vengeance pulled him further from the person he had been, eroding his balance, his judgment, and his ability to grasp where justice ended and obsession began. He felt trapped in his own body, a prisoner of both clarity and disintegration. The adjustment that revealed the truth also crippled him, leaving him powerful only in fury, not in function. He began losing track of time. He drifted through hallways, unable to recall how he arrived. He stared at walls as though they were maps guiding him toward Kai and Michael. His entire world condensed into two names, to faces, to targets. Nothing else mattered. Not Sam, not Scout, not the life he had rebuilt. Everything outside the betrayal felt muted, distant, irrelevant. The adjustment had rewritten his priorities, and revenge had risen to the top as the only purpose worth pursuing. But his body continued to fail him. He dropped objects without realizing they had fallen. His legs buckled without warning. His vision fractured into double images, making the world tilt at angles that should not exist. The injury that nearly killed him was no longer the threat. The real danger now came from the psychological collapse triggered by the truth. His mind was weaponizing itself even as it deteriorated. He was becoming a threat to Kai, to Michael, but also to himself. The adjustment had created a paradox inside him, a man ready to strike, yet falling apart from the inside. Still, the obsession pushed him forward. He imagined confronting Kai first, watching the fear bloom in his eyes when he finally realized Drew remembered everything. He imagined forcing the truth out of him, piece by piece, until the mask cracked and the guilt surfaced. He imagined Michael discovering, too late, that Drew was not the broken man he had intended to eliminate, but a returning force made monstrous by betrayal. These images sustained him, feeding the rage that kept his collapsing body moving. Yet beneath all of this violent determination lurked something far more dangerous, a growing void. The adjustment had twisted his emotional compass so thoroughly that he no longer recognized fear, sadness, or hope. He could not feel relief. He could not feel connection. All he felt was the tightening coil of vengeance and the cold numbness spreading through his chest. Whenever he remembered he had once loved the people who had now become his enemies, this void became an obsession of its own, haunting him more deeply than the betrayal. It convinced him that he was not just preparing for revenge, he was losing the ability to live without it. As the days passed, Drew realized something terrifying. He was no longer certain he would survive the mission he was preparing to carry out, not because Kai or Michael would stop him, but because the adjustment carving its way through his mind was stripping him of the stability he needed to stay alive. He felt himself splitting into two: the soldier who knew how to hunt, and the broken man whose mind was fracturing under the weight of memory. And he knew, with a kind of grim acceptance, that the fracture might soon become permanent. If he succeeded in his revenge, he might not exist afterward in any recognizable form. If he failed, he might collapse long before reaching his targets. In the end, the most chilling realization came quietly. The adjustment had not been a gift or a curse. It was a transformation, one that ensured Drew would never return to who he had been. The revelation about Kai and Michael had pushed him into a darkness where purpose and destruction were no longer separate concepts. And as the obsession deepened, Drew understood that he was no longer fighting to reclaim his life. He was fighting to complete a mission that might very well consume what remained of it. The revenge he sought had already begun reshaping him, and soon it would finish the job. Willow never meant for things to go this far. Or at least that was the lie she repeated in the quiet corners of her mind as she watched Drew Kane struggle against the weight of a body that no longer obeyed him. The paralysis settling into his spine was not an accident, not a tragic complication of his injuries, but the direct result of what she had done to keep her secret buried. She told herself that the injection had been necessary, that Michael needed her, that protecting him was worth more than the truth. But each time Drew's legs failed beneath him, each time he tried to rise only to collapse under the betrayal rotting inside his nerves, Willow felt the reality of her choices tightening like a noose around her conscience. She had crossed a line, not just for Michael but for herself, and now the consequences were beginning to spiral beyond anything she could control. The adjustment happening inside Drew's body was unlike anything the doctors could explain. His muscles weakened even as his mind grew sharper, feverishly piecing together fragments of a truth he was never meant to remember. The deterioration should have made him helpless, but instead it amplified his focus, narrowing his world into a single burning instinct. Someone had done this to him, and he would tear through the shadows until he found out who. Willow watched the shift in him with growing terror. Drew's paralysis was supposed to silence him, to halt the avalanche of suspicion gathering behind his eyes. Instead, it fueled him, trapping his rage inside a broken shell that no longer had limits or caution to restrain it. Michael reassured her that everything was under control, but even he could see the storm building inside Drew. The way Drew's gaze followed him like a blade, the way his breathing changed when Willow entered the room, the way his hands trembled not from weakness, but from the unbearable pressure of truth pushing against the walls of his mind. Willow had not merely disabled Drew, she had awakened something dangerous in him, something feral and stripped of morality. The more his body failed, the more relentlessly his thoughts sharpened into a weapon aimed at anyone who stood in his way. The damage took on new shapes each day. First it was the numbness, spreading up Drew's legs like frost. Then came the spasms, the sudden collapses, the moments where his vision blurred into a haze of heat and fury. But beneath the surface, another adjustment was forming, one that turned every sensation of pain into a thread, connecting back to Willow's betrayal. He didn't understand it yet, but his instincts screamed that her hands had played a role in his downfall. His nightmares replayed the injection again and again, twisting it from a life-saving measure into something sinister, something deliberate. Even in the waking hours, he could feel the echo of the needle like a ghost pressed against his spine. For Willow, the guilt became a second skin. She hid it behind softness, behind controlled breaths, behind the desperate hope that if she pretended long enough, the truth would dissolve. But Michael's fear only fed hers. He knew that if Drew recovered even part of his memory, their lives would collapse in a single devastating blow. Their love, their family, their reputation, everything hinged on Drew remaining weak, confused, and unable to fight back. Yet with each passing day, it became clear that Drew was not drifting into helplessness. He was transforming into something more dangerous than either of them expected. His silence grew heavier. His stillness became predatory. Even paralyzed, he was not defeated, he was calculating. The hospital staff whispered behind closed doors, baffled by the speed of Drew's decline. His test results made no sense. The damage spreading through his nervous system did not match the injury patterns. Something external had accelerated it, something precise and deliberate. Willow felt her chest tighten each time she overheard their confusion. She had planned every step so carefully, but she had underestimated Drew's ability to sense the truth even when his body betrayed him. Each moment he failed to stand was a reminder of her guilt, but each moment he looked at her with hollow suspicion was a reminder of the threat he posed. The adjustment inside him finally took full shape when he realized he could no longer rely on strength, speed, or physical dominance. Instead, he focused on observation, watching every movement Willow made, every whisper she shared with Michael, every flicker of panic that crossed her face when she thought he wasn't looking. Drew no longer needed his legs to hunt them. His mind was enough. The paralysis had taken his body, but in return, it had stripped away the last pieces of hesitation he once had. He was becoming something sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Willow sensed the change too late. The damage she had inflicted was no longer physical, it had opened a chamber inside Drew's psyche, where vengeance grew like wildfire. She thought paralysis would end the threat he posed. Instead, it freed him from the part of himself that once held back. Drew's deterioration was not a collapse, it was an evolution. And as the adjustments within him deepened, Willow realized a truth far more terrifying than the risk of exposure. She had not silenced him. She had created the very monster she feared most.